Unit 1, Lesson 4, The Great Migration. The weekly objectives are to detail the causes of the Great Migration and the rise of Black communities in the northern and western states, and how that tied into segregationist policies and the civil rights movement. Our essential question for the day: how did America's economy, industries, and population grow after the Civil War? Who was migrating, and where were they migrating to, and why? The Great Migration took part in two phases. The Great Migration was the mass movement of people of color, first to the northern states between 1910 and 1940, and second to the western states between 1940 and 1970. Now, a brief introduction to the Great Migration. In this unit, we'll learn why did many African Americans participate in the Great Migration, the various causes of the Great Migration, facts and figures about the Great Migration, migrant life in the city, and lastly, the Great Migration's impact. Segregation laws and practices in the South were discriminatory. Sharecropping jobs where African Americans worked for a share of the crops but no wages were commonplace. Jim Crow laws, which were unequal opportunities meant to discriminate against African Americans in housing and jobs, also were commonplace. And African Americans faced intimidation from terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which attacked them daily. The desire of Black Southerners to escape Jim Crow segregation was a significant cause of the Great Migration. Rural African American Southerners believed that segregation, as well as racism and prejudice towards blacks, was far less severe in the northern states. African Americans saw greater economic opportunities in the North and West. African American workers happily abandoned or left low-wage employment as agricultural workers and domestic workers or servants in the rural South and migrated north in large numbers. They found comparatively high-paying positions in meatpacking plants, shipyards, and steel mills in the major cities of the Midwest and Northeast. These economic opportunities in factories and manufacturing offered steady pay. And there were numerous social opportunities because Jim Crow laws were not enforced. There was not segregation. And there was a greater sense of community with more protections and opportunities for involvement, including voting rights and protesting rights. Of the Great Migration. Over 6 million African Americans migrated between 1910 and 1970. Between 1914 and 1920 alone, more than 500,000 African Americans left southern plantations for wartime jobs in New York shipyards. This migration saw the population in New York increase 66%, while the population in Cleveland increased 307%, and the population in Detroit increased 611%. Factory jobs in northern states typically paid about 3 times more than the agricultural jobs in the South. So community and kinship networks within Black communities in the North and South supported and enabled the Great Migration. Such networks conveyed information about job openings, suitable housing, and other connections in northern cities. First Great Migration between 1910 and 1940. In 1900, 90% of Black Americans lived in southern states. By 1940, 40% increase in the population of Black Americans in Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, New York, and Newark, New Jersey. This often caused tension with European immigrants, mainly Irish and Italian immigrants, for jobs. The late summer and autumn of 1919 saw the rise of racial hostilities, which became known as the Red Summer. Violence and lengthy rebellion between Black Americans and whites in key U.S. cities characterized this period. The causes of this violence differ, but violence was prominent in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, and Knoxville. The Second Great Migration occurred between 1940 and 1970. By the 1970s, 50% of Black Americans had moved out of the South. The increases in population were most dramatic in northern cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, New York, and Newark, New Jersey, and in western cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Phoenix, Seattle, and Portland. There were various migratory patterns that connected specific southern states and cities to comparable regions in the North and West. During the first Great Migration, about half of those who went from Mississippi ended up in Chicago, while those from Virginia tended to settle in Philadelphia. The majority of these patterns were geographical in nature, with the nearest cities drawing the most migrants, such as Los Angeles and San Francisco, receiving a large number of migrants from Texas and Louisiana. Migration patterns were influenced by network linkages. Black Americans tended to relocate to northern places where other Black Americans had previously migrated. Migrant life in the city. Many immigrants found work in factories, slaughterhouses, and foundries, where working conditions were demanding and occasionally dangerous. These factories paid much more than the rural agricultural plantations in the South. Because of the northern market economy and the increase in jobs on shipyards due to the World War I and World War II war efforts. Cities often offered better living conditions in the urban environment. This was especially noticeable in Harlem, New York, amidst the Harlem Renaissance, which became the capital of African American culture and activism. And African Americans often found more personal and individual freedom in northern integrated cities, with less interference from terror groups like the KKK. The impact of the Great Migration. As a result of housing pressures, many Black inhabitants ended up establishing their own cities within large cities, supporting the development of a new urban African American culture. The most visible example was Harlem in New York City, a historically all-white neighborhood that contained over 200,000 African Americans by the 1920s. The Black experience during the Great Migration became a major issue in the artistic movement, which was known as the Harlem Renaissance, and had a huge impact on the culture of the time. The 1920s population rose to over 200,000 African Americans in Harlem alone. It was the capital of African American culture and activism, where Louis Armstrong, a prominent or popular jazz musician during the Harlem Renaissance, would sell out shows routinely. The Great Migration also marked the beginning of a new age of increased political activism among African Americans who, after being rejected in the South, found a new position in public life in the cities of the North and West. This activism, like shown here in Detroit, assisted the civil rights movement directly. When the Great Migration ended in 1970, its demographic impact was undeniable. In 1900, 9 out of every 10 Black Americans, or 90%, lived in the South, and 3 out of every 4, or 75%, lived on rural farms. By 1970, the South was home to only half of the country's African Americans, or 50%. And only 1 in 5, or 20%, lived in the region's rural areas. And we'll recap all of that information on the Great Migration with a short video. These are photographs of one family leaving Mississippi during the Great Migration. Now, we're going to work on this little activity. Use your knowledge of the Great Migration, identify a southern city on the map, label it, and pick a destination city in the north, label it, that an African American would likely migrate to. Write a description of what the journey may have been like, include the number of miles for the one-way trip, names of individual states one would travel through, and a possible job or type of job one could do in the destination city once they reached their destination.